Okay, I'm just gonna let everyone's video and audio load. All right, so thank you everyone for joining us for this roundtable of discussion of police budgeting reform. I am Annie McGowan from the Civic Federation, and I have the honor of facilitating the discussion for this roundtable. And it's my pleasure to introduce an amazing group of panelists for the discussion. But I'm going to keep intros very brief since we have a limited amount of time and a lot of discussion to cover, I'm sure. So I included a link to the supporting materials in the group chat for the floor. So for anyone in the audience, in order to get to the links where materials are included and bios, you can click on the floor group chat. And so with us, we have Chris Morrill, from Executive Director and CEO of the Government Finance Officers Association, Maureen McGough, Chief of Staff at the Policing Project at NYU School of Law, Ivy Lee, Policy Advisor for Public Safety to the Mayor of San Francisco, Karen Volker, Vice President for Strategic and International Partnerships at Cure Violence Global, which uses a health approach to stopping the spread of violence, Rob Henkin, President of the Wisconsin Policy Forum, which is also a member of the Government Research Association, and Sandy Jo MacArthur, who served in the Los Angeles Police Department, including as Assistant Chief for the LAPD, and now serves as a law enforcement consultant and advisor, including as an advisor to the University of Chicago Crime Lab. So we'll just go ahead and get right into it. This discussion is meant to explore ways that police departments are rethinking their service delivery. And so while the events of last year, including the murder of George Floyd, brought the defund the police movement into the forefront, efforts to reform traditional policing practices have been going on for quite some time. And so we're interested in learning about what solutions are involved in delivering public safety in a way that serves communities better. And also from a research perspective, public safety that uses resources in the most efficient and effective way. So the purpose of our discussion today is to learn about approaches being used in jurisdictions across the US in terms of alternatives to traditional policing, and to discuss how researchers and advocates and other outside observers can support and promote smarter budgeting for police and public safety services. And so I'm going to start out by giving each person a chance to talk through their work. We seem to have lost one of our panelists, Chris Morrill. Robert or Lorison, I wonder if you can bring him back in.
Yeah, I'll seek him out.
Oh. Thanks, Rob.
We're having a little bit of tech issues with Mr. Morrill's feed.
Okay.
So hopefully
right,
we can...
Why don't we go ahead? We'll let his video have a chance to try to start working. And in the meantime, why don't we, Rob, if we start with you. The Wisconsin Policy Forum has conducted research on Milwaukee's police department budget and policing policies within the national reform context. And so I was hoping that you could talk about what you're seeing in Milwaukee and Wisconsin in terms of reimagining public safety, and what else you expect to see in terms of long-term strategy.
Sure. So thank you, Annie, and thanks for allowing me to participate in this very esteemed panel. So yeah, let me just start with just a few words on what we have done, the research we have conducted, which may be of value to other GRA organizations who are looking to make a dent in the public's understanding of police reform. But then I just want to show a few slides because as we tend to do, there's a bigger lens through which to view police reform from a social justice perspective and all sorts of other perspectives. But the lens we typically take is a budgetary perspective. So we have a few insights to share on that as well. So just to start, we did release a report a couple of weeks ago. We were actually asked by the mayor of Milwaukee, Tom Barrett, last fall in the wake of not only the national protests, but the local protests that occurred here, both in Milwaukee and, as folks may be aware, there was a very high-profile incident in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So our mayor wanted to form a stakeholders group and wanted it to be broadly inclusive to try to sort of get the ball rolling on where the Milwaukee Police Department needed to be in terms of police reform. And he brought us in, and it was our recommendation as well. He asked us if we could help, and our recommendation back to him was we think we can. We think maybe one of the important things that we can add is just to provide some context to this discussion. No matter where one stands on issues like defunding police and banning chokeholds and so forth, let's just understand, what do the Milwaukee Police Department's protocols and policies say right now? How do those policies and protocols compare to these calls that we are seeing nationally for reform? Then let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into a group of peer cities and just go even deeper. And we were very careful to point out, this is not going to tell us how these policies and protocols are being effectuated out on the street. That's a huge piece of this, obviously. What type of direction is coming from police department leadership, and are the sworn officers on the street actually heeding that direction and following the policies and procedures? Policy researchers, we couldn't get into that. But just in analyzing what was on paper, we thought that we could at least get everybody on the same page going into this very important community-wide discussion about where we stand today before, again, discussing the far more contentious issue of where we should be tomorrow. So we released a comprehensive report. It's on our website, wispolicyforum.org. A few of our researchers, we identified 6 of the key buckets of police reform, ranging from reimagining public safety to accountability and transparency, to demilitarization, to use of force. Those are 4 of the 6 buckets. We took a look at essentially 8 major reports that had either been produced at our state level or locally, or we also looked at U.S. Conference of Mayors, national police chiefs associations, et cetera, to identify, hey, here are the calls for reform and what they say. And we produced a rather thick report that sort of laid out where we stand. So there are people on this panel with far more expertise on police reform itself. So I'll stop there on that topic. But then very quickly, Annie, if we could now share the slides. When the whole controversy around defunding police started last summer, typically for us as a GRA organization that focuses a lot on government finance, what are we going to bring forward in terms of input into this very important but contentious discussion? One of the things that immediately occurred to us was this whole issue of whether, for example, the police department in Milwaukee, whether its budget should be reduced with significant chunks of police department resources being diverted instead to non-police strategies to curb violence, et cetera. We sort of felt like that conversation was really not the most important conversation, because our local governments in Wisconsin are so strapped for resources that the issue of whether to cut police funding has very little to do with ideology and much more to do with the fact that police and law enforcement comprises such a large share of municipal budgets. And given these budget challenges, most local governments wouldn't have much of a choice but to cut police funding. So we wanted to sort of lay that out for people. And we're actually coming out with a follow-up report in a couple of weeks, because this issue keeps on coming up as if it's only an ideological issue. And we want to hammer home the fact that there are some very important local government finance considerations in play here. So what this slide is showing is pre-George Floyd and pre-national and local protests. Between 2018 and 2019, these dots are showing the number of municipalities in the state of Wisconsin who reduced their police budgets. So there was no such thing as defund police at that time, but just because of necessity, mostly fiscal necessity, and I'm not going to get into all the reasons why that is, we were seeing police budgets being reduced even before the protests. Next slide. The related issue was what's happening with police department staffing. And so we took the same look at police department staffing among all of the cities and villages. There are about 600 in the state of Wisconsin. The blue bars are showing those that added officers. There were several. But as you can see, there were just as many orange bars, examples of communities that with nothing to do with considerations around reimagining public safety were cutting sworn strength in their police departments. And then just this one final slide. And this is a big reason why. And again, I don't want to get into the details, though those who know me know I would love to offline, but the details of our property tax levy limits and the other considerations that local governments are facing here. But the fact is that police and fire, because there's also been talk about in our state about trying to penalize local governments if they dare to reduce police and fire department spending in next year's budgets by reducing their state shared revenue payments. This is just showing in terms of the 10 largest cities in the state of Wisconsin, the portion of their budget that is dedicated to police and fire. And so when times are tough with this big a share devoted to police and fire, there is likely to be little choice for these governments, but to at least consider cuts in these areas, irrespective of any ideological considerations. So I'll stop there and look forward to hearing from my colleagues.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob. Next, why don't we go to, and we still haven't gotten Chris back, have we?
He's tried to rejoin.
Okay. We'll give him a couple of minutes. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Well, this is not in any particular order. We have, everyone has great perspective to provide. So why don't we go to Maureen McGough next? You're looking at your work at the Policing Project has looked at trends and alternative responses across the country. So I was wondering what you're seeing in terms of the different programs being used in jurisdictions that you've worked with and how local data is supporting those efforts.
Great questions. And thank you so much for having me. As Annie mentioned, I'm Maureen McGough. I'm the Chief of Staff at the Policing Project at the New York University School of Law. And we are a nonprofit that is focusing, among many other things, on the concept of reimagining public safety and really understanding how best to disaggregate the police function. Before I talk a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of national trends, I think it's important to just take a step back for the conversation. We really work at the intersection of communities and police, and this is one thing that sort of both stakeholder groups seem to agree on, and that is that we're asking the police to do too much. I think a lot of times in this conversation, it's sort of seen as perhaps the police don't support an exploration of these types of alternative responses. But in many cases, particularly the chiefs we talk to are acknowledging that they are not equipped with these skills or training necessary to respond to a lot of what they're being asked to respond to. So they are a key stakeholder in these types of exploratory conversations. The other thing to just sort of keep in mind too, when we talk about reimagining public safety from community perspectives, and we talk about public safety needs, one thing that keeps coming up over and over and over again is that fundamental public safety needs seem to be almost identical to social determinants of health. So even though we're talking about this in terms of public safety systems, there's sort of a much broader stakeholder group that's relevant to providing these services over time. So I just wanted to flag those two things. At the Policing Project, we're the lead researchers for a global research effort coordinated through the Global Law Enforcement and Public Health Association, GLAFA. And as such, we've been tasked with identifying all of the sort of burgeoning alternative models that are cropping up in North America, particularly since the police murder of George Floyd. And when we talk about sort of alternative systems of responses, we're basically just talking about alternatives to 911 dispatch and sending a police officer to the scene. So they sort of are falling into three main buckets across the country, and I'm sure you've seen examples of all of these. The first is the sort of alternative response model, where a call comes into dispatch and a response is sent that is not a police officer. So there's no enforcement or force associated with the response. Usually it's someone who's got a broad skill set, like a social worker. The other is the co-responder model. And so that's usually someone with behavioral or mental health skills who's dispatched alongside a police officer. Oftentimes they ride along in the cruiser. Sometimes these people are actually stationed in the call taking center, so they can help de-escalate a situation over the phone or help a call taker understand whether or not an alternative response is appropriate. And then the last thing we're seeing, and honestly, this is probably the most common in terms of what we've seen so far, is just trying to improve police response as it currently exists. So improving the types of training that police officers receive, or changing the incentive structure for police officers so that they're no longer tracking arrests, for example, and are instead tracking resolution, diversion to services, those types of things. Obviously, these models are very promising when compared to the status quo, and you look at some of the sort of pervasive issues that we're facing in public safety in this country. But I did also want to throw a couple of flags and that sort of limitations to our understanding of these models. One is there's very little social science out there around the field of dispatch. And when you think about having all of these alternative models at the municipal level, the dispatcher plays a critical role in the success of those alternative models. And we don't know a lot about risks associated with certain call types, for example. And there's real inherent risks of harm if you don't send the police when they're needed, or if you send the police when they're not. And that's part of what people are trying to combat in the current moment. Also, without some type of sort of rigorous evidence base, there's also a risk of perpetuating these disparate impacts. So it's really not hard to imagine a scenario where you have a jurisdiction, they've got an alternative response model that's an option, but absent some type of objective measure, you find yourself in a situation where alternative response models are set more frequently to predominantly white communities, and traditional police responses are set more often to Black communities. So that's something that needs to be researched to sort of prevent. And then the other is just sort of keeping in mind, Annie, you asked about local data, and I'm sure if you're in this convening, you're well aware of the limitations of local data, but public safety data in particular is pretty limited and tough to rely on. And one of the things that we found it's actually difficult to articulate at the jurisdictional level is what people need when they call 911. So you can have some type of call classification to understand what are the types of calls coming in, but understanding what those underlying needs are associated with those calls are much more difficult. And also, local data really only tells you about the needs of the people who are willing to call for government assistance in the first place. It doesn't capture the needs of the people who aren't comfortable calling for government assistance for any host of reasons. But in jurisdictions that do have usable local data, where there have been sort of very significant investments in sort of cleaning the data and understanding what the limitations of the data are, one thing that keeps coming up is that the types of calls for which alternative responses are currently designed, the mental and behavioral health calls, they're actually not all that common. So if a jurisdiction is implementing an alternative response model because in part they want to narrow the police function or divert funds away from the police department, just assuming that you'll have an alternative response model for behavioral mental health issues is not necessarily going to accomplish the goal of decreasing the burden on your police services. So it's just a little bit more complex than that. And we're actually working with, I think, we're at 9 jurisdictions across the country to try and help them understand their local data and make more informed decisions about sort of the underlying public safety needs that their communities are demonstrating.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And I think we'll probably come back to the co-responder models throughout the discussion. And I do want to encourage everyone to, this is intended to be a conversation. So if you have questions that arise from something someone says, please feel free to jump in and ask follow-up questions. And so Ivy, Lee, why don't we go to you next to hear about your perspective as a policy advisor, the work being done in the San Francisco mayor's office to reform the public safety strategy there.
Thank you, Annie. And thank you for the invitation to be here with everyone. I apologize for having my camera off, it's definitely freezing up. So I'm just gonna keep it off while I speak. I really want to appreciate what Rob so far has said, as well as Mo, because in San Francisco, I think we're a little bit of an outlier in many ways. When it comes to public safety reform, San Francisco already has reformed its department, its SFPD, as far as its policies regarding use of force. So several years ago, we already had the banning of the chokeholds. We already had the mandatory reporting of officer misconduct. We already have a Department of Police Accountability, which is an independent agency with the ability and authority to investigate police misconduct. So, just in a lot of different ways, we already have implemented the reforms that a lot of cities and jurisdictions are talking about now. So where do we go from here? We still have officer use of force. We still have in custody deaths. We still have a lot of the issues that other jurisdictions are struggling with. So clearly it's not enough to just look at improving policing, right? So I think our mayor, Mayor Breed, she and our police chief, Chief Scott, we are really fortunate that they are actually on the same page as far as what they want to see moving forward. So back in June, we actually published a roadmap for reimagining what our public safety system would look like overall. I'm really interested in hearing what Karen has to say, because I think we took a kind of a public health mindset when it comes to policing and our public safety system. We really, and I'm going to oversimplify this, but really what we took a look at is first disaggregating the police function. We tried to separate that out and try to figure out what exactly is the need that we are trying to resolve when we send an armed officer response. And in every instance where we do not need to do that, then let's stop. So we have successfully launched a couple different crisis response teams over the past year that actually send behavioral health clinicians, as well as community paramedics and peer advocates, folks who have actually, struggled and overcome their own challenges when it comes to either mental health or substance use disorder. And they are the ones now that respond to all of our mentally disturbed adults calls that come in through 911. We also have an opioid response team that is launching in the next few weeks, where they will respond to folks that are in need of either, an immediate kind of overdose response, or, are very likely or at high risk. So those are some of the alternatives that we've stood up over the past year. So the disaggregation of data is really driving what we're doing, but also just changing the mindset. So again, I mentioned the public health mindset, where we're trying to create a system where, I think like our healthcare system was at a few years ago, where we had less of an emphasis on prevention and more of an emphasis on treatment after the fact. And what we'd like to do is turn that around. So in San Francisco, what we are doing is investing heavily in prevention. We are trying to have, the whole full spectrum of violence prevention, violence interruption. And I think most of you know already what those concepts mean, but basically trying to prevent like the retaliatory shootings, trying to boost the economic opportunities for youth so that they never are just as involved in the first place, for example, and investing in mental health resources so that folks that are struggling, right, with these types of situations and illnesses, that they get the treatment that they need. And this also involves, right, prevention as far as homelessness. When you have folks that are so disinvested in the system, I think you're all aware, just the natural limits of like this social contract that we have is very hard to adhere to, right? So, and any way that we can remove the impetus for someone to actually commit a criminal act, or what we define right now as a criminal act, we are trying to remove. And the last thing that I would say is that, while we have to do the improving of policing at the same time that we're creating alternatives, we are really focused on two other aspects going into the next year. The first is really increasing our investments as far as economic opportunities go for our Black and Brown communities. So we have spent about $120 million over the last year. We've programmed that into trying to address equity, right? And then the second piece that I think is not, usually mentioned enough is trying to focus on survivors. So, regardless of what what the stance is on being justice involved, one of the things that's very clear is that, and I will be very blunt and excuse my language, but victims are treated like crap in our system. And if we ever want restorative justice as a concept to really take hold and have traction in San Francisco, at least, we need to make sure that survivors of crime also feel heard, and that we are offering them options to actually, compensate for what they have gone through as much as we can, and make sure that we're not re-traumatizing them through the criminal legal process, and that they actually have a place at the table when it comes to shaping public safety reforms. So that is the other aspect of this, is that, we can't forget about the survivors, because if we do, there are definitely folks with a very different mindset and a different set of ideas for how we should go about reform that are ready to occupy that space. So, I see this as more of a preemptive thing. We do not want to return to these, tough on crime. Let's talk about sentencing enhancements. Let's talk about additional sentencing. We don't want that to be the avenue that folks go down. And if we don't give them an alternative idea that feels right, that they are a part of, then that is the fear, right? That they will go down that track, and that we will go backwards as far as reform. So I'll stop there, but happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ivy. And there's definitely some things that you touched on there, like the investment and the prevention, that I definitely want to come back to and touch and get deeper into. But first, let's go next to Karen Volker, because Karen, you work in the violence prevention work as well. So that's kind of in line with the things that Ivy was just talking about. And then we'll go to Chris. And Chris, I am sorry about the technical difficulties, but I'm glad we have you back. So Karen, go ahead and tell us about your work at Cure Violence. And I'm especially interested in kind of how the program is modeled and funded and where it resides.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you for including us in this panel. It's great to be here. Cure Violence is one of many organizations that uses a health approach to interrupting and stopping violence. We are probably we view ourselves as the originator of the concept. The organization was founded by Dr. Gary Slutkin over 20 years ago. And now, though, a lot of people are beginning to see and understand violence from a health perspective. So just very quickly, what that means is that we treat violence as a behavior that can be prevented and which acts or spreads like a contagious disease. Now, I want to let that sink in for a second, because it has real implications then for the potential to treat violence differently, right? So if it's a behavior, then you can use behavior modification to try to change that behavior. We also know that behaviors are impacted by norms, and these norms are very specifically and very focused in the communities where you have the high levels of violence. So working on changing those norms is an important aspect of this approach. So the actual approach has got three main components. It's the same three components that the World Health Organization uses to interrupt and stop the spread of a contagious disease. So it's detect and interrupt, which Ivy referred to violence interruption, change the behavior of the highest risk, and change the norms. So what's important to think about here is two things. One is that in an epidemic control model, which this is, you start in the area where you have the highest concentrations of violence. In those neighborhoods, it's very difficult for police or anybody not from those neighborhoods to really gain credibility and be able to go in and work with great effectiveness. So what we do is we train organizations that are from those communities in how to manage a violence prevention program. They hire people from those communities who have credibility with the people that we're trying to reach, in this case, the people who are doing the violence. And we get them, not we, Cure Violence, but these organizations and the workers that they select carefully are trained to use their influence to stop people from doing violence before it happens. This is not something that anybody from the outside can do. And in most cases, I think there was a reference, I can't remember if it was Ivy or someone else, that people are in these communities often are afraid to call the police. So it's not even really an option for them to call the police because they have a fear that the police, by calling the police, they're going to put themselves in more harm. So, and I'm sorry to say that, but I mean, that is how they feel in these communities. But we have workers, they have workers in these communities who they do listen to and they do trust. So it's an additive measure that can be used very specifically in these highly violent neighborhoods. So preventing violence before it happens stops people, saves lives, but it also stops people from going to jail. So it has like the two positive benefits. Like a friend, one of our interrupters and trainers says that you save 2 lives every time you stop an incident of violence. You save the life of the person who didn't get killed, and you save the life of the person who didn't go to jail for the rest of his life, right? So it's really both of those that are super important. It also, for the purposes of this conversation, I think it's really important to focus on the fact that saving lives and stopping shootings saves money. And it can pay for itself, but the problem we have in our country is that the money that's saved is in a different budget line than where the money that you usually spend to pay for the program. So if this money comes out of, I don't know whether you're taking, let's say it comes out of the police, the savings are in the health sector or it could save money in the police budget, but it's also going to save money in the criminal justice system. And it's going to save money in the health, police, justice, and law enforcement. All save money when there's less shootings and less killings, right? So, but somehow these are not equal. They don't kind of cross over very easily. And I think that's part of our job, is to sort of recognize that and figure out how do we make the math work and justify the cost. The second thing is that there's other positive benefits, which I think was referred to below with the social determinants of health, or above, I mean, social determinants of health. There's other positive impacts when you decrease violence. Educational outcomes go up in these communities when violence goes down. In many of these communities, there's invisible lines where kids don't go to school because they feel too afraid to go across as an invisible barrier. But if we reduce those invisible barriers, we reduce the violence, more kids are able to go to school. And their educational outcomes improve just because they're not living in such a violent community, right? There's also increases in investment. Businesses will move into communities as violence levels go down. Housing values go up. There's studies that show this from Philadelphia and from other places in communities when violence levels go down. That then generates increases in taxes or other benefits. So all of this needs to be thought about holistically, and we need to see how it's all interconnected. So it's not, in this case, when I was asked to talk, I was very happy to do it. It's not about Cure Violence. It's not about our organization. It's about this different approach being more effective, specifically in these highly violent neighborhoods, and that what it offers everybody benefits, whether you're in law enforcement or the health system or any place else, when the violence levels go down. So Annie, I don't know if I touched on all the things that you were looking for, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
In the interest of time, we'll keep moving to Chris. Let's go to you next, and then we'll go to Sandy Jo, and then we'll open it for questions. I know I have many questions, which we will not have time to get to in the hour. But Chris, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so it's so good to be here with you today, and really enjoyed what Karen was saying. Our goal is to get finance folks, the budget people, the CFOs to think holistically, think in terms of social determinants of health and those other things. Most cities, though, they approach it with an approach called incremental budgeting, where you pretty much get a little bit increase from each year. The problem with that, it freezes past practices. It does reduce conflict, but sometimes you need conflict to bring change. And then you don't get input from the community because you don't want to change things if you want it to be incremental. And probably most damaging is that it continues past inequities. So we've looked at budgeting holistically and then really zeroed in on police budgeting because it's so top of mind now. And so we've developed 7 best practices around police budgeting. I'll go through them quickly. First, historical precedent should not determine future spending. So you really should focus on how to do things cost effectively, not look at how you did things in the past. Departments and divisions are not the best decision-making units for budgeting. You really should disaggregate into programs so you can make decisions based on those. Give you an example. Citizens don't say, I want more public works, give public works more money. They say, I want safe streets. And so to change the mindset like that. Third, that, and there's systems that can help with that. There's something called priority-driven budgeting and budgeting for outcomes that help change your decision-making into values about services. Third, to think outside of department silos and look for multidisciplinary approaches. We know that crime is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous problem. So no one agency, no one sector can really solve it. So you have to think across departments and across sectors, with the private sector, higher education sector, the nonprofit sector, and really use the budget process as a forum to bring all those perspectives together. Fourth, as we talked about earlier, is that often budgets are focused on remedial actions. And so we say give prevention a chance. And I think cure violence is a perfect example of that. And we don't talk enough about prevention. We're too focused on the remedial knee-jerk reactions. Number five, I think this will be music to everyone's ears in the audience, is to tie data and evidence to the budget process. There's lots of good research out there. Local government leaders need to look at that research and then use it in their decision making. And so, for example, I found in the city where I was city manager, we trained police in Lean Six Sigma, and that changed the way they did a lot of their work. Number six, look for smart, strategic ways to reduce costs and invest the savings in what works. So you can't cut your way to prosperity, but you can cut and reinvest. So, you may look at centralizing support services. You could wider use of non-sworn staff, I think, can both be more cost effective and more efficacious in your outcomes. Share services with neighboring jurisdictions. Focus on prevention rather than remediation, as I said. Divest of low-value services. Do you really need a horse patrol? We found with data that school resource officers aren't often effective. So really, put your money and your resources where it makes a difference. Review the number of special units. We find over time, whenever there's a problem, the police create a special unit for it. You may have 15, 16 special units. Well, we found by using a Lean Six Sigma approach, we're able to combine them all, cross-train, reduce the staff by half, and redirect them to community policing without any more cost, just being smart with it. And then review barriers to do the right thing. Often in budgeting, if you don't spend the money by year end, you lose it. And so, we create these perverse incentives to go on spending sprees. Everyone thinks they have to maximize their padding in case there's a crisis because, nobody wants to go over budget. We have to change the way we approach this, and there's things we can do. Number seven, and probably most important, is to change the mindset from either or a zero-sum approach where I win, you lose, police gets more money, they got to take it from Parks and Rec, to really a both and. And I want to leave you with this visual. This is from a process they did in Charleston, South Carolina, called polarity management. So Annie, if you could pop that up. I'll end with this. So the whole idea is that it's not public safety or individual rights. It's public safety and individual rights. And the community actually went through and identified when you have benefits of both, because both are important, and when you're getting to the negatives. So you can actually diagnose that. And you look at outcomes, and if you're falling below the line in the two lower quadrants, there's a problem. And so the whole thing is that it needs to be an and in that holistic approach. And there you could, if you Google polarity management, you can pull up one of these that you can fill out yourself. You can do it around public safety. We've done it around tradition versus progress. There's a whole range of things you can use it for. But so those are the seven best practices we have. We have a paper written on it, which Annie will have as a link to it if you want more information. With that, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. And so Sandy Jo MacArthur, let's go to you next to talk about your experience in the Los Angeles Police Department. I'm especially curious how reforms can come from within. Chris just talked about how we're trying to get municipal government leaders to make changes from within. So not just reformers coming in from outside. So curious on your thoughts on that.
Hey, good morning. Thank you everybody for letting me join this great group of people. And everybody has said some really important critical components, I think, that need to come together. I'll talk in just a second about how for example, we lived with a 13-year consent decree and how we were successful in embedding the consent decree components into basically what I call the DNA of the department. But then, and it goes back to kind of what Ivy was talking about, sustaining it going forward and not just sitting on your laurels and actually pushing it, continuing to improve. And I think those are some of the things that I can share a little bit with you. But one of the things I'd like to just touch on budget, because I had the budget for several years with the LAPD. And the budget within the department was its own issue, its own animal. And then the budgets externally. We talk always about how, and I think, Chris, you just mentioned the specialized units and the siloing of specialized units within the organization. Sometimes the specialized units are actually created because of the push from somebody across the street. We call it across the street from government. We need this, we need that. And if they don't see it immediately and something we can track immediately, they don't think we're doing anything about the problem. So we have a homeless task force, or this task force, or that task force, so there's this dynamic that happens with policing and city government that we are our own worst enemies. So instead of pushing back and saying we have a better way of doing something, a holistic approach, we say, oh, the easy way to do it is to have the specialized entity, and then it's their problem. And it really backfires. And it's just, there's got to be a lot more discussion and transparency and less siloing in general. But the reason I was using that as an example, because you've all talked about it in your own ways, budgets in the city are siloed. So one of the biggest things that I find with budgets that become very problematic, and to go back to Annie, your question about how do you create change from within, until we have a more holistic approach in the budget process, we have very little opportunity to start to merge some of those silos, because certain monies are earmarked for this silo. So again, we actually are our own worst enemies within city government and within the police department, trying to do quick answers versus long-term solutions to problems. So I see the problem with what we're talking about now. It's called defunding the police, whatever you want to call it. Ivy talked about it. They've been doing things in San Francisco for a very long time. Several of you have talked about other examples. LA, we've been doing something now for about 7-8 years within the police department, but it is a more holistic approach. It's the community safety policing model that we are trying to do exactly what you all are talking about, having a public safety mindset in attacking violence, right? So if you're just using enforcement, we will always have the ups and the downs and we can go in and we can crush crime, but at what cost? Of sending half of our young African-American population to prison, right? And then we have this lull, and then all of a sudden things start to go back up. So that's always going to be in a cycle, unless we take an approach, a public health approach, which we refer to it as a wraparound model. And in order to do that, you can't have siloed budgets in a city or in a county for that matter. And I know, Ivy, you probably have had this experience where some things are city driven and other things are county driven when you're talking about different things. And if the two aren't linking them together, we end up, quite honestly, and nobody's said this, we end up with people competing for whose program is better than others. And then there's very little evidence based on any of the results. And we see money going to potential fixes, and somebody's in business for 2 years and then they go away and we don't have any results. Was it effective? Wasn't effective? Things like that. So we need to in order for us to defund, and I hate to use that term because I think it's the wrong term. You have to first take your most critical communities, whether it is because of addiction issues, homeless issues, or violence issues. Those are like the three biggies, right? So let's go with violence. You can't go in and defund the police until you stabilize that community enough to then bring in the wraparound services, because you can't just say, okay, police are pulling out, wraparound services are coming in, and good luck. You can't do that. And we did this, we did it and UCLA has done an assessment of it. We started the CSP model in South Central Los Angeles, in one of our areas that was notoriously our highest homicide. And Karen, you talked about the cost of homicides. Rand's got a great project study out there from years ago, how much one homicide costs to a community, to a city. But we were able, in a matter of 1 year, to go from a little over 100 homicides in this one district, one area, down to none. And it was not because police came in and crushed crime and used handcuffs. It was alternatives to handcuffs. It was getting in there, but had to stabilize the community first before you could bring people in. The other thing that we did with this model, which I think is a really important component, which many of you have spoken about, is we still had a lot of silos in the general budgetary issue outside of the police department, but we worked with HACLA, which is our housing authority. HACLA and the police department worked together with their budgets to do the stabilization. We weren't able to do it with a lot of others, but it was very easy because, quite honestly, HACLA had cut out all of their police. So LA was now policing, right? But HACLA still had a lot of funding for different programs in the housing project. So we were able to merge them very comfortably. When I say comfortably, it wasn't without conflict, but people sat down at the table, worked through it. We also had people from within.
Wendy, Joe, sorry, let me just ask you to, since we only have 10 minutes left, if you can. Okay. No, finish your thought, but I wanted to.
My finishing thought, and I'll summarize it this way, is we have created a monster throughout history of siloing, whether it's internal within an organization or whose job is what. We've got to break all of those barriers down so that we can cross-pollinate. Because when we do that, police can be used to do the things they need to do, but you've got to get in there and stabilize a community so then we can bring in the wraparound services and we can start to develop the capacity for communities to be, to be healthy communities.
And I do want to point out that there's a question in the chat, which I'll get to. And if other people in the audience have questions, you can click on floor in the chat area and type your question in there. So there's two things that I want to make sure that we cover real quickly, because we only have a few minutes left, which are the kind of dichotomy between the and or question. Does investment require more money, or a shifting of priorities, or a shifting of funding? Or, I think different places are doing it different ways. But that's one thing that I wonder if we can touch on real quick. Whoever feels like they would like to talk on that for a minute. Sure, Rob.
So from the perspective of what we've learned with regard to large cities in Wisconsin, I think clearly the case is, if there is a desire to reimagine public safety by investing more in violence prevention and social determinants of health, et cetera, it's going to require more money. In our case, and I didn't get to this point, but the city of Milwaukee in its 2021 budget cut its sworn strength by 120 police officers. They went down from 1,800 to 1,680. You would imagine that might have freed up, $10 million to reinvest in other areas. No, it didn't save a dime. It all went into the increase in fringe benefit and salary costs for the remaining sworn officers and other police personnel. So in our case, cutting staff, which arguably based on the amount of violent crime we're seeing in our city would not be a good idea. Even if, no matter how you feel on that question, it's not going to free up the resources to invest in these other things.
Okay. One of the questions that came in through the chat was the role that unions play in these issues. And that was a question that I have as well, because we know that the Chicago police contract is limiting in terms of where savings can be made, because some of those things are embedded in collective bargaining agreements. So would one of you be able to talk about the role of unions in these budgeting issues?
I can talk to it briefly. And I have to say, this is very regionally driven, because you get to the Midwest and you go east, they're very, very strong. You go west of the Mississippi and the unions don't have the same strength. what I find in LA, which is a little bit different than my work that I've done in Chicago, is if you can when I say co-opt, I don't mean it in a negative way. I mean, you can get unions to agree with you that we need change. That's the first step. And unions can actually be very helpful moving things forward. We wouldn't have gotten our consent decree done and all the budgetary issues surrounding the consent decree if we hadn't worked collaboratively with the union. So I think it's possible. I do think the farther east you go, I think it becomes a little bit more difficult. Rob and Chris, you may have some thoughts on that.
Did either of you want to add anything? Okay. So then another question that we have is for small police departments. So 10 officers or fewer, for example, what strategies are successful in those very small departments?
Yeah, I think then even the small departments, it's even more critical that they collaborate across departments. I mean, the reality is they're probably going to be more connected to the community, but staffing shifts are going to be an issue. But so they really do need to work there and across other police departments. So maybe if 3 small communities can get together and do a vice unit out of that rather than each of them having their own, I think it's just going to really. It's going to take much more collaboration at the smaller government level.
Okay.
And I'll just add one thing on that. Seeing the 44 smaller agencies in LA County, we've worked with them over the last 6 years. They did exactly that, Chris, where they would have these co-response teams, and then they were able to actually do a force multiplier working with the county and having a co-response team that would cover different shifts, so they could do more of a 24 or 20-hour a day response and cover 2 or 3 jurisdictions.
And then going back to some things that were touched on earlier in terms of the prevention, how should departments be more proactive rather than, someone said the knee-jerk reactive? What can departments be doing? And especially then to also achieve savings by being more proactive thinking and strategic. Whoever would like to take that one. Sure, Karen.
So I guess the point I would make is that if they can sort of just even recognize the limitations, their own limitations in reducing violence in some of these very violent neighborhoods, and that there are other ways to go about it, and acknowledging that some of these other ways might be more effective. That's one. 2, that violence prevention costs a lot less than normal the police force, and so it's not like it takes a lot less money to sort of put into place a violence prevention program. So just to sort of think about that, in several cases this past year, it's been the police department that's reached out to Cure Violence to talk to us about bringing our program to their city. So there's some police departments that are really understanding this and reaching out proactively and encouraging us. The last thing I want to, if I can, just say something about something that was said earlier, which is about the sequencing of things. And that is that when you have very high levels of violence, in order for all of these other types of services to have the impact that you want them to have, you have to bring the violence down first, because those other kinds of programs won't be able to succeed in the context of that high level of violence. So whatever you do, think about that and then sequence the other things, the wraparound services, to come in as you bring down the violence, would be my recommendation. Sorry to throw it all in there, but my recommendation.
Yeah, Maureen, go ahead.
I just want to heartily echo Karen's point there about the fact that so much of what science shows is effective for prevention is completely outside of the purview of the police department, and making sure that the lens is wider in that discussion. And then also really stressing the value of community input and empowerment as well. It's very unlikely that public data sets and public officials are actually going to have the insight about what works and what matters for prevention at the local community level. So making sure they have a voice at the table for those discussions.
Okay. Rob?
Just very quickly, for the benefit of other GRA people who we tend to look at things like efficiency and service sharing and consolidation. And one of our concerns at the Wisconsin Policy Forum is that, again, with all of the emotion surrounding these issues, these nuts and bolts things are going to be overlooked. So in the city of Milwaukee, we have separate dispatch operations for our police department and our fire department, and now they're being merged, and that's going to save some resources. Things like that have to be looked at. The relationship between local police departments and sheriff's departments at the county level. There is clearly opportunities for sharing and consolidation there. So those things should not be given short shrift either.
Okay.
Can I just say one? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
Go ahead and ask a question. Someone has their hand raised, so we'll bring them in. But in the meantime, go ahead and say what you want to say.
Yeah, so I think, and I've seen this work, where you just have to change the budget process, where the police chief, she's not just looking down at her services, but looking across. And so when you get the leadership team together in decision making, understanding each other's issues, and I'll tell you, I knew we had made progress when the police chief said, I'm going to give up 2 police officer positions so we can hire 3 early childhood librarians, because that's going to make a bigger difference in the long run. And it's all because we shared information and educated across it and looked at holistically, as everyone has been recommending here.
Mm-hmm. And so, Tim, you can go ahead and ask your question. We are out of time, so this will have to be the last quick word.
I recognize that, and I apologize for taking the last word from others, but I'm Tim from Citizens Research Council. I'm the health affairs specialist there. In our research with other GRA organizations, we've seen that I think public health approaches to public safety are great, but we don't even take a public health approach to health. We spend 3% of health dollars on public health. We focus on treatment, not prevention in the health sector, and we defund local public health agencies and community mental health. And so I wonder if there are arguments against service duplication in police departments rather than just investing in public health as a means of prevention, and particularly multi-tiered prevention that not only looks at social contagion effects from an epidemiological perspective, but also looks at early childhood exposures, childhood trauma, ACEs, and other factors that we know predispose people to difficulty in education and the criminal justice system across the board. So I guess, where do we invest, and how do we make the argument, especially for primary prevention efforts that don't show up within a single budget cycle, because it takes years of data collection to differentiate from the secular trend?
All right. Well, we are unfortunately out of time. 1 hour was definitely not enough to cover this topic. So there's always a chance to follow up. If anyone would like to follow up with each other, or if anyone in the audience would like to get in touch with somebody, you can contact me. I'll put my email address in the floor chat. And one other thing I want to mention is that Karen messaged me that Cure Violence Global has over 20 studies and 8 independent evaluations that are available about the effectiveness of the health approach. And so if anyone would like more resources or information, or just to follow up with questions, you can use me as a vehicle to do that. And so I would like to thank all of you, our panelists, for participating. This was such a great conversation that only scratched the surface. And so thank you all for your time.